It must be by his death. And for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. He would be crowned. How that might change his nature, there's the question. It is the bright day that brings forth the adder, and that craves wary walking. Crown him? That. And then I grant we put a sting in him, that at his will he may do danger with. The abuse of greatness is when it disjoins remorse from power. And to speak truth of Caesar, I have not known when his affections swayed more than his reason. So far, Shakespeare's Brutus. The murder of Julius Caesar was a planned paramilitary operation, according to author Barry Strauss. And he claims that Caesar's assassins regarded him as a military dictator who wanted to be king and had to be stopped. Brutus and Cassius were indeed key players, as Shakespeare has it, but they had help of a third man, Decimus, a mole in Caesar's entourage. One of Caesar's leading generals and a lifelong friend. It was he, not Brutus, who truly betrayed Caesar. The three men had to talk about the plan. What techniques of classical rhetoric did they repurpose for interpersonal communication to persuade people to take out Caesar? We don't have all the details we want to know. We don't have a transcript like Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. If they could apply the tools of classical rhetoric to interpersonal communications, so can we. We can learn from a modern pair of books from the Black Swan group, led by Chris Voss, his own Never Split the Difference, and Ego, Authority, Failure by Derek Vaught. Prior to 2008, Chris Voss was the lead international kidnapping negotiator for the FBI, as well as the FBI's hostage negotiation representative for the National Security Council's Hostage Working Group. During his government career, he represented the U.S. government at 2 G8 conferences as an expert in kidnapping. Before that, he served as the lead crisis negotiator for the New York City division of the FBI. He was a member of the New York City Joint Terrorist Task Force for 14 years. He had involvement with the Blind Sheikh case and the TWA Flight 800 catastrophe, and negotiated the surrender for the first hostage taker in the Chase Manhattan bank robbery hostage taking. This session is going to compare Chris Voss's book about lessons learned from terrorist negotiations with the tools for classical rhetoric, possibly used by Brutus and others to assassinate Caesar. How can rhetoric, one of the neglected parts of the trivium, help you in the classroom, speaking or writing to other audiences, and in application with persuading people in one-on-one conversations? I enjoyed Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, recommended to me by a brother pastor finishing a term as a circuit visitor. But it led to a question. Why do these hostage negotiator techniques work? They work because they repurpose tried and true tools of classical rhetoric for crisis conversations. Whether this is intentional on the part of Chris Voss, Gaunt, and the Black Swan group is a question that remains to be answered. Interpersonal communication is itself in crisis, with people on their phones and not really talking with one another or paying attention during sessions. In addition, we should use the tools of classical rhetoric in our own crisis conversations. This is the social science side. Communication studies, not part of classical rhetoric as we narrowly define it. Our friend and rhetorician, speaking right over there, Dr. James Tallman, explains. There is a social science division within speech communication and a rhetoric side. The rhetorical studies subdiscipline is traced back to the Greco-Roman world. The social sciences trace back to the Enlightenment. They are at odds, and the social sciences, of course, garner all the attention these days. As a result, the rhetorical side is more compatible with traditional liberal arts education, indeed are vital to it. But few scholars today approach rhetorical studies that way. There is a remnant in composition rhetoric in the English department. But I, Dr. Tallman, argue that the richness of the liberal arts approach is realized in the oral tradition, speech. Writing a cogent essay is critical, of course, but being a speaker of words and a doer of deeds, so to speak, and being of use to God in the marketplace involves cultivating quick wit, intellectual play, and imagination. The best place to develop those skill sets is in debate, practiced in a manner that cultivates intellectual integrity, wisdom, and imagination. In brief, the tools of rhetoric may be used or adapted successfully for interpersonal communication, but interpersonal communication isn't properly part of classical rhetoric. The roots of the conspiracy of Brutus, Cassius, and Decimus against Caesar began with personal conversations. Shakespeare puts a simple motivation in Brutus's mouth in the play. He loved Rome more than he loved Caesar. Caesar was ambitious. His death meant protecting the Roman people from a tyrant. The conspirators had to persuade people that removing Caesar from the scene was a good idea. Voss and Gaunt make use of quick thinking, intellectual imagination, and tools that I've identified from classical rhetoric in their crisis interpersonal communications. And you can too, only we're not negotiating with terrorists. Let's define two of the important concepts of the books Never Split the Difference and Gaunt's book, Ego, Authority, Failure. The latter functions like a sequel and a recapitulation. Those are tactical empathy and the black swan. Tactical empathy. Voss defines the concept. Tactical empathy is the process of knowingly and intentionally influencing your counterpart's emotions to make deals. He gives a more complete explanation. Harvard Law professor Robert Mnookin defines empathy as the process of demonstrating an accurate, non-judgmental understanding of the other side's needs, issues, and perspective. Empathy does not require people to have sympathy for another's plight, to feel their pain, nor is empathy about being nice. Empathizing with someone, therefore, does not mean agreeing with or even necessarily liking the other side. The FBI, on the other hand, defines empathy through the lens of hostage negotiation as this: identification and understanding of another's situation, feelings, and motives. Voss says, I knew we were onto something when we considered that both the FBI and Harvard define empathy pretty much the same way. He shared these tips on how to get started. At the Black Swan Group, we use tactical empathy to deal with the bad, the mad, the sad, and sometimes even the glad that we encounter every day at our jobs and social interactions and even in our family gatherings. How? With a simple three-step process. Tone of voice, no denials or disagreements, and make them feel heard. How to get started. 1. Tone of voice. In all cases, the late-night FM DJ voice. Soothing, combined with upward, inquiring, or downward, understanding inflections is the critical touch. 2, no denials or disagreements. The key to any sort of empathy, he says, no matter who is defining it, is no denials or disagreements. This doesn't mean ignoring the stuff you don't like either. You need to make them feel heard. So, make them feel heard. There's a fine line here, and it's where the real power of tactical empathy comes from. You don't agree, but you don't disagree either. Here's an example. If you know they feel like you're ignoring what they want, instead of denying it, call it out with a label. Don't say, I don't want you to think we're ignoring what you want. Say, I'm sure it seems like we're ignoring what you want. That's just an observation. You're not agreeing, you're not disagreeing. You're making the tactical choice to diffuse a negative by labeling it. No one feels heard when you ignore what you're inclined to disagree with, but these topics are precisely where you need to make them feel heard. Anyone can make someone feel heard on the stuff you mutually agree on. That approach takes no talent, no courage. Tactical empathy isn't an agreement. Talent and courage come into play when you make someone feel heard on the issues that are exactly where the disagreement or the anger might be. What are we avoiding? 1, I understand. Don't say this, Voss says, ever. Take the time to articulate what you do understand. Don't take a shortcut. You're also trying to avoid yes, but, or I understand, but. No one wants you to put your butt in their face. There are many occasions when people say I understand as a well-intentioned gesture. Intention is insufficient alone. You wipe it out with the word but you quashed your own good intention. Take the extra time to articulate what you do understand, then go silent so it sinks in and it has the effect that this tactical empathy was conceived for. He recommends trying this out in a low-stakes kind of conversation to get a feel for it. It worked. All the delays trying to get to Denver, from Denver. I didn't have to sit on the second plane next to the bathroom because of tactical empathy. I got a shuttle ride from the Hyatt because of tactical empathy. Now, the Black Swan. That's the name of Voss's company, the Black Swan Group. It's important to him and what his team does. He attributes the definition of the term to Nassim Nicholas Taleb. If you don't know that name, you should. He spent 21 years as a quantitative trader before becoming a researcher in philosophical, mathematical, and mostly practical problems with probability. He's known for his inserto, 5 books: The Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, Anti-Fragile, The Bed of Pro-Trustees, yes, and Skin in the Game. It covers uncertainty. It's been translated into 43 languages. He refuses all honors and anything that, quote, turns knowledge into a spectator sport. This has all been very fascinating reading for me, and I ran across his writings in 2 different ways, through Voss's book, but also in researching the idea of resilience in order to provide better pastoral care to folks who have really struggled due to the virus and the responses to the virus, shall we say. I like much of what Taleb has to say about robust anti-fragile systems. But let's understand what is meant by a black swan. In the prologue of his book of that title, he writes, "Before the discovery of Australia, people in the old world were convinced that all swans were white, an unassailable belief as it seemed completely confirmed by empirical evidence. The sighting of the first black swan might have been an interesting surprise for a few ornithologists and others extremely concerned with the coloring of birds, but that is not where the significance of the story lies. It illustrates a severe limitation on our learning from observations or experience and the fragility of our knowledge. One single observation can invalidate a general statement derived from millennia of confirmatory sightings of millions of white swans. All you need is one single, and I am told quite ugly, black bird." There are 3 attributes. First, it is an outlier, as it lies outside the realm of regular expectations because nothing in the past can convincingly point to its possibility. Second, it carries an extreme impact, unlike the bird. Third, in spite of its outlier status, human nature makes us concoct explanations for its occurrence after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. Taleb stops and summarizes his triplet: rarity, extreme impact, and retrospective, though not prospective, predictability. A small number of black swans, he says, explain almost everything in our world, from the success of ideas and religions to the dynamics of historical events to elements of our own personal lives. Taleb allows for evolution in his writing, caveat lector. Ever since we left the Pleistocene some 10 millennia ago, he writes, the effect of these black swans has been increasing. It started accelerating during the Industrial Revolution as the world started getting more complicated, while ordinary events, the ones we study and discuss and try to predict from reading the newspapers, have become increasingly inconsequential. And then there's this footnote I thought you'd like. The metaphor of the black swan is not at all a modern one, contrary to its usual attribution to Popper, Mill, Hume, and others. Taleb says, I selected it because it corresponds to the ancient idea of a rare bird. The Latin poet Juvenal refers to a bird as rare as the black swan, rara avis in terris nigroque simillima signal. That's from Satires 6. So Voss carries this forward, begins applying it. Black swans are just a metaphor, of course. Think of Pearl Harbor, the rise of the internet, 9/11, and the recent banking crisis. None of the events above was predicted, yet on reflection, the markers were all there. It's just that people weren't paying attention. As Taleb uses the term, the black swan symbolizes the uselessness of predictions based on previous experience. Think about it. Turkey, the day before Thanksgiving, and the shock on the day of Thanksgiving. Black swans are events or pieces of knowledge that sit outside our regular expectations and therefore cannot be predicted. Here's where he goes. This is a crucial aspect in negotiation. In every negotiating session, there are different kinds of information. There are those things we know, like our counterpart's name and their offer, and our experiences from other negotiations. Those are known knowns. There are those things that we are certain that exist, but we don't know, like the possibility that the other side might get sick and leave us with another counterpart. Those are known unknowns, and they are like poker, wild cards. You know they're out there, but you don't know who has them. But most important are those things we don't know that we don't know. Pieces of information we've never imagined, but that could be game-changing if uncovered. Maybe our counterpart wants the deal to fail because he's leaving for a competitor. Those unknown unknowns are black swans. Black swans are those things we look for in pastoral care or in the classroom that really change everything and help us really care for a member or a student once they're revealed. And there's a lot more of that concept to explore. I think that tactical empathy and black swan concepts are helpful, interesting, practical ideas. I think they'll help you in life. The tools of classical rhetoric can help you in the classroom, speaking or writing to other audiences, and in application with persuading people in one-on-one conversations. So, how do the concepts presented in these books overlap with classical rhetoric? Never split the difference and ego authority failure. Apply aspects of classical rhetoric and other rhetorics in unique ways. We've heard of Juvenal's use of the black swan. That's just a minor quote from classical literature. Hostage negotiation takes the tools of argument and persuasion to the field, to crisis situations. Classical rhetoric famously has three appeals: ethos, logos, pathos. Voss and the Black Swan group make use of all three: ethos, character and goodwill; logos, the substance and style of discourse; and pathos, arousing emotions that further their cause. Tactical empathy is largely pathos, but heavily dependent upon logos and especially ethos. Classical rhetoric's five canons make an appearance too: invention, topics, arrangement, style, memory, delivery. Invention's brainstorming stage has to happen very quickly as the negotiators find that ideas, and sometimes black swans, that help persuade the bad guy to stop doing bad things. Topics helps you flesh out an issue. Arrangement means putting your ideas into an argumentative skeleton. Voss is clear about what he recommends saying and what he recommends not saying and when. More on that later. Style, how you say it. This is the place where the late night DJ voice comes in. Mirroring, echoing, rapport. It sounds like is one of the techniques he uses. This is style as well as delivery with body language and intonation. Finally, Voss makes you depend on your memory. You got to remember a whole book full of good tips in order to use them. I recommend reading the book, then listening to it, and then reading it again. Classical arrangement is not used in full or so formally in interpersonal communication, but we see the elements pop up. One has to establish who you are and why you're the right person to address the situation. Exordium. Narratio establishes the facts that everybody agrees on. Divisio is where all the contentious matters come up, like hostages, demands, a getaway car or copter. We don't have time to get into all of Voss's and Gaunt's stories of success and how they learned some things the hard way. Confirmatio, offer the arguments of your side, lots of logos. You also have to refute the other side's arguments. That's reprehensio, more logos. Cicero would advise Voss to handle sidebars here, related issues, digressio. And then comes the big emotional appeal, the ask. Build on the report and trust of ethos, make use of all the logos you have, including black swans, and make your ask. Peroratio has lots of pathos. Voss's techniques are largely the judicial forensic species of classical rhetoric, not so much the ceremonial or the deliberative. I'm still looking through both books, looking for enthymemes. I'm more optimistic of finding something closer to Toulmin's modern reinvention of the epikyreme, but we're really in the weeds now. It would also be too detailed to mention specific uses of metaphor, catachresis, analogy, hyperbole, repetition, amplification, and wit. But it was pretty fun to see another concept, praeteritio, making clear in his advice what you are not to say, where to remain silent. Concessio means conceding a point. That's part of his advice to beware of yes, don't trust it. Sometimes people will say yes just to get you to shut up. Focus on the no. There's a lot more to this book. Buy it if only to learn how to get a better deal on your next car. And how to survive a contentious voters' meeting, school board meeting, maybe even a synod convention. A practical tool for those situations is another I want to teach you in brief, the accusations audit. This third tool, in addition to the black swan and tactical empathy, is anticipating objections, known as protocalypsis in classical rhetoric. Here's Voss again. An accusation audit is a listing of the negatives the other side's got in its head against you. Biases, prejudices, preconceived notions. So make a list. Make it practical. Get out in front of this stuff, because calling them out in advance, even if they're not there, has an inoculating effect. Instead of planting negatives that aren't there, it inoculates the situation from having them happen. And since our brain is wired to be negative, yeah, poor miserable sinner, it's only smart to get out in front of that stuff. His example. If I were to say to you, look, I don't want you to feel like I'm taking advantage of you, that's going to raise your guard. That was a denial. But if I say, look, it probably seems like I'm going to take advantage of you, that's going to diffuse the potential negative. And if it wasn't there in advance, you're like, oh, okay, well, nah, I didn't feel that way. You actually deny it and block it out. So the accusation audit doesn't plant negatives, but the only way you get used to it is by test driving it. Do one before a contentious meeting. Start working days, weeks, months ahead of time. Deal with the objections before the meeting, or get them out of the way by mentioning them yourself as part of your presentation at the meeting. With the concepts of the Black Swan, tactical empathy, and the just mentioned accusations audit, you have some new practical tools and hopefully a little better understanding of classical rhetoric. We will never have a transcript of the interpersonal communications of Decimus, Cassius, and Brutus and their applied rhetoric that persuaded enough people that Caesar was a threat. Yet we do have Shakespeare. People remember Antony's funeral speech more than that of Brutus. As we wrap up our time, let's briefly figure out why. Shakespeare's Antony uses a more multifaceted argument, including emotion, pathos. Antony sways the crowd to his side against the conspirators, against Brutus. His rhetorical devices from Shakespeare's pen are more effective and more numerous. Shakespeare's Brutus bases his whole approach on his own reputation alone, ethos. This was his only source of proof, his reputation. So all Antony had to do to win the day and the hearts and minds of the crowd was to destroy the honor of Brutus. He did this repeatedly by saying, Brutus is an honorable man. Yet he rhetorically communicates the opposite. Shakespeare's Brutus also omits any logical arguments or tangible proofs of Caesar's ambition. No use of logos. And Antony gave examples that Caesar was not ambitious. Did he lie to the crowd? He was more rhetorically effective and more memorable. Shakespeare's Antony better used the tools of classical rhetoric and won the day in the play. To this day, my father, high school class of 1957, can still recite Shakespeare's Antony. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. So let it be with Caesar.
Could you repeat the 5 books that you were talking about to Neos?
Yes. Nassim Nicholas Taleb wants to sell you a box set. It now has 5 books. All you need to search for is the Portuguese term incerto, I-N-C-E-R-T-O. It means uncertainty. Yet I don't think anybody had copyrighted it or trademarked it in English. The books are The Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, Anti-Fragile, The Bed of Pro-Trustees. It's a book of aphorisms, The audiobook is an hour long. It takes a lot more time than that just to mentally digest. Read, mark, learn. Do you know the story of the Bed of Pro-Trustees? Some of you do. Some of you are smiling with that smile that Procrustes himself might have. He had, according to the story, either one or two different beds for travelers who would stay with him. And he would always make the person fit the bed by stretching or by amputation. In the more gruesome version of the story, he would intentionally put the tall people, not me, in the short bed and make them fit, and the short people in the long bed with a bit of stretching. The point of all of the aphorisms is that we tend to mentally do this ourselves. We try to make ideas fit into our preconceived boxes or round holes, depending on the case, and not everything fits. He goes on and really emphasizes the idea that if something's truly a black swan, you can prepare for it, but you can't see it coming, which makes it a black swan. You have an enormous amount of uncertainty in a sinful fallen world, but some really easy and predictable ways to prepare for it. The forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ our Lord. That would be our way. He recommends going to parties. You never know who wants to network with you. And that might be the Black Swan event where you meet your bride or you meet your new business partner and your whole life changes. Okay, so Bed of Pro-Trustees and Skin in the Game is the newest. They used to sell a box set of 4. If you're really a Taleb junkie, there is a term for that, but I'll spare you of that. You can get his technical inserto. There's a hardcover book that's a print-on-demand deal, and you can download the second volume for free and print off a copy. All of these essays on mathematical statistics, genetics, quantitative finance, statistical physics, philosophy, ethics, economics, international affairs, and so weiter. So, yeah, thanks for the question.
You had a bunch of Latin rhetorical terms in there, and I've heard many of them before. Where is a good classical writing or modern resource that goes through what those are as far as the parts of a speech?
There's a lot of Greek terms, largely, and I'm still a student sitting at the feet of Dr. Tallman for many of them. One of the books that I looked at a lot to get ready for today is from Wooden Books, and there's a book like you'd find in the discount aisle at Barnes & Noble called The Trivium. You can get it online, support your local independent bookseller too. There's also a book called Quadrivium, but it goes through all of the technical terms, the Latin ones, the Greek ones, even the English ones we weren't taught in public school, and catechizes you. So just Google or Yahoo or DuckDuckGo, Trivium, Wooden Books. Thank you.
Could you say something about maybe the ethical side of what looks to be a utilitarian use of manipulation?
Yeah, that's something I have struggled with. I think about Spider-Man a little bit. And, you know, what his dying uncle said in, was that the first round of Spider-Man movies? Yeah. We should use our superpowers for good and not for evil. So this means we're getting into proper rhetoric, not demagoguery. You have to have the virtuous, the righteous, the forgiven person speaking well. I'm glad we've got guys like this who are negotiating with terrorists, people who've been trained with this kind of stuff. I mean, it's hard enough sometimes negotiating with, well, people like me who love the liturgy, or arguments at a synod convention. It really depends on that righteous person. So all of this is going to be understood very differently from a secular audience than the way the saints in the room are going to take this. So yeah, very appropriate question. All right. Thank you very much for coming.